Daisy, 34, has always been the quiet achiever. A financial portfolio manager, she's built a successful career, but at home, her family has never treated her with the respect she deserves. In their eyes, she's always been the responsible one, the designated failure. But Daisy has a sanctuary. Her condo, a place she bought with her own hard-earned money. It's the one space where her value isn't questioned. However, on one particular birthday, a cruel joke from her family was the last straw, pushing her to finally reclaim her dignity and take control of her life every year without fail. Daisy found herself dreading her birthday. It wasn't the passing of another year that bothered her. It was the annual gathering at her mother's house. The event had long since stopped feeling like a celebration and had become more of an obligation, a family ritual, if you could call it that. Where the script was always the same, Daisy would show up, quietly, hoping for a flicker of recognition, only to be drowned out by the louder, more demanding personalities in the room. And the main offender, her brother John. John, 4 years older than Daisy, had always been the golden child. No matter what Daisy achieved in her life, John's accomplishments were the ones that always took center stage. He never had to work as hard to gain attention. No. John's life seemed to unfold effortlessly. He had a booming career, a charming family, and a seemingly perfect life. His achievements were paraded around like trophies, and every year, Daisy, who had worked tirelessly in her career as a financial portfolio manager, watched as John received all the accolades while she stood in his shadow. This particular year, Daisy hoped things might be different. She'd just closed a major account at work, a deal that had taken months of relentless effort. It was a career-defining achievement. Maybe this time, she thought, maybe this time they'd see her for what she was, a capable, successful woman. She'd even brought an expensive bottle of champagne, hoping to mark the occasion with some positivity. But as she entered the familiar house, the scent of old wood and potpourri filling the air, she felt the same sinking feeling she always did. Her brother John was holding court in the living room, recounting some business story with his usual loud voice, as if he were a king surrounded by his loyal subjects. Megan, John's wife, was busy snapping pictures on her phone, clearly angling for the perfect shot to post later on social media. Her life, always carefully curated for the cameras, never felt real. Megan was a lifestyle blogger who had perfected the art of looking like she was living her best life, even when it was clear to Daisy that it was all for show. Meanwhile, her mother, Imogen, fluttered around like an eager bird, her pride for John blindingly obvious. Daisy had always been the invisible one in this household, and that day was no different. No one said happy birthday when she walked in. No one even really acknowledged her presence. They just nodded, barely glancing in her direction, as though she was some sort of late caterer who was merely there to make the room look fuller. Daisy placed the bottle of champagne on the counter and gave a tight-lipped smile. "Hi, everyone," she said, her voice barely rising above a murmur. Her mother, who had always been the source of Daisy's silent yearning for approval, turned to her with a slightly strained smile. "Oh, Daisy, you're here. We were just hearing about John's incredible month. He's on track to be the top director in his entire region." Daisy forced herself to smile, though it felt as if her jaw might crack. "That's great, John," she said, her words tasting like ash in her mouth. John, as expected, barely acknowledged her. He grunted, clearly too busy relishing in his own glory to look her way. The afternoon dragged on, each second stretching out longer than the last. The conversation, if you could call it that, revolved entirely around John, his work, his achievements, his plans for the future. Megan channeled her role as the perfect wife and added her own stories about partnerships and brand deals, making sure to mention every product she just collaborated with. Dylan, John's 10-year-old son, was there too, though his attention was mostly focused on mocking Daisy whenever he could get a rise out of her. He was quickly learning from the masters of the family, his father and his mother, that disrespecting Aunt Daisy was not only acceptable, but encouraged. Daisy tried to interject a few times, to steer the conversation towards something that might include her. But it was like speaking into a void. Her words fell flat, quickly swallowed by John or Megan, who would swoop in with louder, more important stories. There was no room for Daisy at this table. Her life, her work, her successes, all irrelevant. The sound of John's voice, dominating and arrogant, filled the space like a thick, heavy fog that she couldn't escape. Then came the worst part, the gift exchange. Daisy had never looked forward to it. It wasn't about the gifts themselves. It was about the performance. Every year, she'd try her best, choosing thoughtful, expensive presents for each member of the family. She hoped that maybe this time, her gifts might soften their attitudes, might make them see her not as a failure, but as someone who was worth something. But the gifts they gave her, they were always afterthoughts, jokes wrapped in cheap paper, humor laced with cruelty. The year before, it had been a self-help book titled How to Be More Charismatic. The year before that, a cheap gym membership with a note that read, "Time to work on yourself." Daisy had learned not to expect anything else. But still, she held on to a foolish hope that this year might be different, that maybe, just maybe, they'd see her for who she truly was. But no, it never was. And it never would be. After a dinner where Daisy barely touched her food, poking at her plate as she listened to John regale another story of his latest business victory, Imogen clapped her hands. "Time for presents," she announced, her voice rising with a sharp edge of excitement. The room seemed to hush, though Daisy wasn't sure if it was out of respect or just a temporary lull before the chaos of their yearly performance. Dylan ran into the room, a small, sloppily wrapped box in his hands. "From all of us," he said, thrusting it toward Daisy. She saw the mischievous smirk on his face, the same one John had whenever he was about to make fun of her. I knew that smirk, Daisy thought. It was a smaller version of his father's. With shaking hands, Daisy took the box, feeling its lightness, its emptiness. She slowly unwrapped it, the paper tearing easily. Inside was a small plastic trophy, the kind you could buy at a party store for $1. On the plaque at the bottom were the words, "Participant." The word punched Daisy in the gut. Participant. That was how they saw her. She wasn't a winner. She wasn't even a contender. She was a participant in their lives, a background character, just there to make the family story look fuller. The room was silent as Daisy stared at the trophy, her face betraying no emotion. But inside, it felt like a bomb had gone off. The laughter, the sneers, the teasing, it all built up to this. John, Megan, and Dylan, all of them watching her, their faces alight with amusement, knowing exactly what they were doing to her. It wasn't just the trophy. It wasn't the gift. It was the cruel, relentless reminder that they saw her as nothing more than a joke, a failure. John, of course, found it hilarious. He chuckled, the sound thick with mockery. See, she gets it. It's just a bit of fun. Daisy, you've got to learn to laugh at yourself. Megan, always ready to chime in, added her voice, sweet as syrup but sharp as a knife. It's a term of endearment, really. We love that you always try so hard. Even Amagigan, her mother, patted Daisy's arm, her touch almost too light, too distant. Don't be so sensitive, dear, she said. It's just your brother's way. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't fun. It was cruelty. Daisy had spent so many years searching for their approval, hoping they would see her as more than the designated failure. But it was clear now, they never would. They enjoyed this, the mocking, the cruelty. They thrived on it. Daisy forced a brittle smile, the muscles in her face protesting as she managed to hollow. Very funny. But her attempt to play along only seemed to fuel their amusement. The room filled with laughter, loud and unrestrained. She was nothing more than a punchline in their twisted family game. And that's when Daisy realized, for the first time, just how broken this family really was. It wasn't just a joke. It wasn't just harmless teasing, and it was something darker, something cruel. And Daisy? She was their favorite target. The moment Daisy opened the box, she felt her heart sink. She'd hoped, foolishly, that this year would be different. After all, she had just accomplished something monumental in her career, closing a major account that had taken months of hard work. She thought that, maybe, just maybe, they would see her for what she truly was, a capable, successful woman who deserved at least a moment of recognition. But instead, all she got was a cheap plastic trophy. It was the kind you could find at any party store for $1. It was small and light, and when she lifted it out of the crinkled tissue paper, she could feel the hollow weight of it in her hand. The words engraved at the bottom of the trophy were simple, cold, and utterly crushing. Participant. Daisy stared at the tiny trophy in disbelief, feeling a lump form in her throat. The words were a slap in the face. Participant. That was how they saw her. She wasn't a winner. She wasn't a contender in their eyes. She was just someone who was there, taking up space, filling in the gaps, a participant in their lives, their stories, their drama, but never the star. Not once in her life had Daisy felt like she truly belonged in that family. And this gift, this trophy, was the confirmation of everything she had feared. It wasn't a gift, it was a reminder. A reminder that no matter what she achieved, no matter how hard she worked, she would always be the designated failure, the one who could never get it right. She looked up from the trophy, her hands shaking slightly, and saw them all watching her, waiting. John's face was twisted with amusement, his eyes dancing with a joy that Daisy couldn't understand. He thought this was funny. He thought humiliating her was something to be proud of. Megan, standing beside him, was already pulling out her phone, likely preparing to capture the moment for social media, to share with her followers just how hilarious their family was. Her smile was wide and sweet, but it held a bitterness underneath, a sweetness laced with cruelty. Even Dylan, John's 10-year-old son, was grinning. The smirk on his face mirrored John's, a copy of his father's mockery. And then there was Daisy's mother, Imagigan, who had always claimed to be proud of her children, was smiling too. But it wasn't a smile of love or appreciation. It was a smile that came from somewhere colder. It was a smile that suggested this was all just a joke. That Daisy, her daughter, was nothing more than a source of entertainment. Daisy felt the familiar pang in her chest as her mother looked at her. Not with the warmth she so desperately craved, but with something distant, almost detached. The woman who should have been her strongest ally was just as lost in the twisted narrative that had been created around Daisy. The silence in the room stretched, a suffocating moment that felt like it lasted forever. John's laughter broke it first, loud and cruel, a bark of joy that reverberated through the walls. "See, she gets it," John said, his voice thick with mockery. "It's just a bit of fun. Daisy, you've got to learn to laugh at yourself." His eyes were alight with satisfaction, as if he had just delivered the perfect punchline. His laughter was like a slap, each chuckle digging into Daisy's skin, making her feel smaller and smaller, more invisible than ever. Daisy tried to steady herself. She forced a smile, one that felt so fake it hurt her face to hold it in place. "Very funny," she managed to say, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. It wasn't even an attempt to join in the joke anymore. It was a reflex, something she did to survive. She had spent so many years learning to smile through the hurt, to mask her pain with a veneer of politeness. But deep down, it was breaking her. This wasn't just a joke. It was a lifetime of disregard, of being the punchline in their twisted family comedy. Megan, never one to miss an opportunity to show off her ability to pretend everything was fine, chimed in with her syrupy sweetness. "It's a term of endearment, really," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We love that you always try so hard. You're such a trooper. Daisy." Her words were laced with a bitterness that made Daisy want to retch. She could feel Megan's eyes on her, the judgment there even as Megan smiled sweetly. It was all part of the act, wasn't it? Megan's life, her brand, everything about her was about crafting the perfect image for the world. But Daisy knew the truth. Megan wasn't trying to help. She wasn't trying to be kind. She was just like the rest of them, treating Daisy like a joke. But the worst part wasn't Megan. It wasn't John's smug laughter. It wasn't even Dylan, who was clearly getting a kick out of watching his aunt squirm. No, the worst part was Imogen, Daisy's mother, the woman who had always been the cornerstone of her family, the one person who could have protected her, who could have stood up for her. But instead, Imogen just watched, her smile tight and unfeeling, as if this whole spectacle was nothing more than entertainment. Daisy wanted to scream at her. She wanted to demand why her mother wasn't seeing this for what it was, a cruel, humiliating game that she had been forced to play for far too long. But she didn't. She just stood there, the plastic trophy still in her hand, feeling the weight of it like a boulder. It was supposed to be a gift, a simple gesture of appreciation, but instead, it was a mockery. It was a symbol of everything Daisy had been to them. Nothing more than a participant, never a winner, never good enough. As Daisy stood there, holding the plastic trophy, the words on the plaque burned into her mind, participant. That was her place in their lives. That was the role they had given her, And then, as if the trophy wasn't enough, John pushed it further. He looked at her, his eyes gleaming with cruelty, and laughed. "Come on, Daisy, you've got to learn to laugh at yourself," he said, the words dripping with an arrogance that made Daisy's stomach turn. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying watching her suffer, watching her crumble under the weight of his laughter, under the weight of his family's contempt. Daisy tried to hold on, tried to steady herself, but the sting of their words, the mockery in their eyes, was too much. She could feel her heart breaking in slow motion, the shards of her dignity falling away with each chuckle, each mocking word. She wanted to leave. She wanted to walk out of that house and never look back. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Something kept her sitting there, unable to break free from the chains of their expectations. She could feel their eyes on her as she sat there, clutching the stupid trophy, her entire body screaming to just stand up, to just walk out. But no, she stayed. She stayed because for so long she had been conditioned to accept this, to accept the disrespect, the cruelty, the constant reminders that she was never enough. And for a moment, Daisy thought maybe she would just accept it this time. Maybe she would just let them have their moment of triumph. Maybe it was easier to just play along, to stay small, to stay invisible. But then, as the laughter echoed in her ears, Daisy realized something. This was the moment when she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine. She couldn't pretend that this wasn't destroying her. The cruel words, the plastic trophy, it wasn't just about that moment. It was about a lifetime of being ignored, belittled, and laughed at. And in that instant, something inside her snapped. The world she had spent years trying to keep together, trying to hold on to, finally came crashing down. She wasn't their punchline anymore. She was done. Daisy could feel the anger rising inside her. And for the first time, it wasn't fear. It wasn't the old, familiar feeling of wanting to be accepted. It was something different, something stronger. It was time to take control. Time to stop being the participant in their little game. Time to reclaim her life. And it started now. Daisy had hoped, in some small corner of her heart, that this year would be different, despite the constant reminders of her place in her family's eyes, despite the years of being the overlooked, dismissed one. She still carried a small spark of hope. And this year, she thought, she would show them something meaningful, something real. She would give them a gift, not just a trinket or something out of obligation, but something that truly represented who she was, something she had worked hard for, something she believed in. The silver locket she had chosen was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of her promise to herself, a promise that she would no longer be a passive participant in her life. It was engraved with a tiny, intricate world map, a reflection of her dreams to one day explore, to step out of the shadows and live the life she had always hoped for. She had saved up for months to buy it, carefully putting aside money each month. It wasn't cheap, but it felt right. This locket wasn't just a birthday gift, it was a statement, a mark of who she was becoming. Daisy had carefully wrapped it, making sure to preserve the delicate feeling of it. She was going to give it to them, to her family. in the hopes that maybe they would see her for the first time in years. She imagined their reactions, imagined them admiring her thoughtfulness, maybe even feeling a little guilty for the years of neglect. Maybe, just maybe, they would understand that she was more than their punching bag. But as she stood in the living room, holding the small box in her hand, she realized how foolish that thought had been. The dinner had finished, and the usual chatter had resumed, with John continuing to regale his latest work victories, Megan chiming in with the tales of her influencer collaborations. Dylan was playing in the corner, but Daisy could see the sneer in his eyes as he glanced up from his game. And there, at the center of it all, her mother, Imajigan, the woman who should have been the first to notice, was sitting there, her attention divided between John's voice and the sparkling phone in her hand. Daisy felt the weight of her own words, her own life, shrink into the background once again. But this year, she told herself, was going to be different. With a shaky breath, she walked over to the group, holding out the box. "I actually got myself something for my birthday this year," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Something I've wanted for a long time." Her family glanced at her, momentarily pausing their conversations. John's smirk seemed to grow wider, and Megan's eyes narrowed just slightly. Dylan stopped his game, but only for a moment, before his attention flickered back to whatever held his interest. Daisy ignored it all, focusing on the small moment of connection she hoped to achieve. She opened the box carefully, revealing the silver locket. It gleamed softly under the overhead light, catching the reflection of the room. She felt a small rush of pride. This was hers. This was her gift to herself, her promise of something more. "I've always wanted to travel more," she said softly, the words almost shy as she watched them take in the locket. "This is a promise to myself, to see the world, to not just be a participant in my life." For a moment, the room was still. Megan leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she appraised the locket, a flicker of something that Daisy could only describe as envy flashing across her face. The locket was clearly expensive, clearly elegant, and in that instant, Daisy thought maybe, just maybe, they might see her, they might understand, but it didn't last. The silence, that brief, fragile moment of connection, was shattered by John's derisive snort. "A locket? What are you, 12?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Daisy felt the first sting, but she tried to swallow it down, to let it go. But John wasn't done. "What's with the map?" he continued, his voice growing louder, sharper. "You barely leave your condo. The only place you go is to work and back. You're not some world traveler." "Daisy, what's the point?" Daisy felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her pulse quickening as she clutched the locket tighter. This wasn't just about a gift anymore. This wasn't just a simple remark. It was the familiar sting of being belittled, of having her dreams mocked by the people who were supposed to care for her. But there was no escape this time, no way to avoid it. The words had cut through her like a knife. But before she could say anything, Dylan's voice rang out, high-pitched and shrill. "It's stupid," he shouted, his face contorted with glee as he reached for the locket. "It's boring." He snatched it out of Daisy's hand before she could even react. "Dylan," Daisy shouted, her voice rising in panic. She felt the sharp spike of fear and anger. "Give it back," she demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. But Dylan, emboldened by his father's approval, held it up as if it were nothing more than a dead insect. John, watching the scene unfold with an almost sadistic pleasure, leaned back in his seat, his legs stretched out in front of him, a lazy, malicious smile spreading across his face. "I don't know, Daisy," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "He's got a point. It is pretty boring." He looked from his son to his wife, and Daisy saw the cruel amusement in his eyes. "Maybe a little fire would make it more exciting," he added, his tone thick with mockery. Dylan's grin grew wider. "Yeah, can we put it in the fire?" he asked, looking to his father for approval, as if this was some great idea. Daisy's breath caught in her throat. The air felt thick and suffocating. She could feel her chest tighten as panic set in. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "No. Dylan, give it back to me now." But Dylan was already running toward the fireplace. The locket clutched in his small hand. Daisy was on her feet before she knew it, lunging toward him, her body fueled by a desperate need to protect what little she had left of herself. But it was too late. Dylan had already reached the hearth, the fire crackling in front of him. Without hesitation, he tossed the locket into the flames, the silver glinting for a brief moment before it landed among the glowing logs. "No," Daisy screamed, the word tearing from her throat, raw and guttural. She felt the rush of horror as the locket began to melt, the silver darkening as it warped and twisted in the heat. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, they laughed. The laughter that had haunted her for so long, the laughter that always made her feel small, insignificant, faded into a roar that filled the room. John laughed first, his voice booming as he wiped away tears of amusement. "Look at that," he gasped between breaths. "Look at her face. She actually cares about this junk." Megan joined in, her laugh shrill and fake, a mocking sound that echoed in the air. Even Amagigan, her own mother, watched without moving, her smile wide and cruel as the fire consumed Daisy's gift. Daisy stood there, frozen, her heart breaking with each second. She could feel the heat of the fire against her skin, but it wasn't the fire that burned. No, it was the cold emptiness that spread through her chest as she realized, truly realized, what her family thought of her. She wasn't just a failure in their eyes. She was a joke, a laughingstock. The pain was overwhelming, crushing. It felt like her whole body was being sucked into the flames, like her very soul was being burned away along with the locket. She had given them something real, something meaningful, and they had taken it from her with the same cruelty they always had. As the fire continued to crackle, Daisy could only stare at the flames, her body trembling with rage and grief. The locket was gone now, but what really hurt was the realization that this wasn't just about a piece of jewelry. This was about the years of humiliation, the years of trying to connect, of trying to be seen, only to be met with mockery and cruelty. This was about the fact that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she would always be the joke, the punchline in their twisted little family game. She should have left then. She should have stood up, dropped the trophy on the floor, and walked out without saying a word. But the lifetime of conditioning, of seeking their approval, kept her glued to her seat. her heart shattered by the very people she had always hoped would love her. The silence after the laughter was deafening. Daisy forced a smile, her lips trembling as she tried to mask the hurt. "Very funny," she said again, her voice flat, hollow. Her words seemed to fuel their amusement even more. John laughed again, a deep barking sound that made Daisy's stomach churn. "See? She gets it," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "It's just a joke. Daisy, you've got to learn to laugh at yourself." But Daisy didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She couldn't. The fire inside her had been extinguished. And in its place, there was only a cold, empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. Daisy felt the weight of the moment crash down on her all at once, like an avalanche burying everything she had built. The laughter still echoed in her ears. But it wasn't just the sound of mockery that lingered. It was the cold, hollow realization that this wasn't just about a gift. It wasn't just about a locket being thrown into the fire. This was about everything that had led to this moment, the years of trying to win their approval, the years of giving and giving, always hoping that this time, this year, they would see her, really see her, and finally recognize her worth. But all she had received in return was cruelty, disrespect, and indifference. She stood frozen in that living room, watching the flames flicker as her locket melted away. The laughter continued, but it felt like a distant sound, as if it were happening in another room. It felt surreal, almost as if her mind was struggling to comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't just the destruction of a piece of jewelry, it was the destruction of the last tiny thread of hope she had held on to. The hope that, despite everything, her family might actually care. The hope that, despite being called a failure all her life, there was still a place for her in this world they had built around themselves. Dylan, still laughing, looked at her with an expression of sheer amusement, as if this were all just some game he had won. John's smug smile never faltered, his eyes shining with self-satisfaction as if he had just delivered the final blow in a fight he had been waging for years. Megan, of course, was recording everything on her phone, capturing the hilarious moment for her social media followers. They were all in on it. They were all complicit in making Daisy feel like less than nothing. And her mother, her own mother, was standing there, watching it all unfold with a smile that was so bright it nearly blinded Daisy. But it wasn't a smile of pride or love. It was a smile of approval, a smile that said, "This is fine. This is how things should be." Magagan didn't look at her daughter with the warmth of a mother's love. No. She looked at Daisy as if she were just another character in the background of John's grand story. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was enough. It was the same silence that had been there for years. The silence that Daisy had learned to live with, but never fully understood. And in that silence, something inside Daisy broke. For so long, she had tried to convince herself that this was just how families were, that maybe she was too sensitive, that maybe she was overreacting. But now, standing there in the midst of their laughter, Daisy realized the truth. They didn't love her. They didn't care about her. They merely tolerated her because she was useful, because she was the one who quietly took on responsibilities, who always showed up, who never caused a fuss. She had spent her life trying to fit into their world, trying to be someone they would accept. But the truth was, they had never really seen her at all. They had never cared to. She wasn't a person to them, she was a background character, a prop in their little game. The sharp sting of that truth cut through her like a blade. She had built her life around this family, around the hope that they would one day see her, that they would one day recognize her as something more than just the quiet, responsible daughter. But now, standing in that room, watching her gift, the one thing she had given to herself, burned to ashes, she realized that this family wasn't worth holding on to. Daisy had spent so many years chasing approval, working harder and harder to prove her worth to them. She had given them money, time, energy, and love, hoping that one day they would look at her and say, "You did well, Daisy, you are enough." But instead, they treated her like a joke. They mocked her successes. They belittled her achievements. They saw her as nothing more than a convenience. And in that moment, Daisy understood that all the sacrifices she had made for them, all the things she had done to help them, had never been about love. They had used her, and she had let them. She could feel the tears rising in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She refused to give them that satisfaction, to show them just how deeply their cruelty had cut. No, she couldn't let them see her break. Not this time, not anymore. Without a word, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. But somehow, she managed to keep moving. She didn't want to look back. She didn't want to see their faces, the smug smiles, the self-satisfied looks that said they had won. They had always won, but not this time. This time, she was walking away, and she wasn't coming back. As she reached the door, she heard John's voice behind her, loud and cutting as always. "You're just going to leave, Daisy." Just like that. His voice dripped with mock concern, the kind of tone that only served to remind her of how small and insignificant she really was to him. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She didn't owe them anything. Daisy stepped out into the cold night air, the door shutting softly behind her, the noise from inside, the laughter, the casual cruelty, faded as she walked down the driveway. She could feel the weight of the night settling over her, the deep, suffocating realization that her family had never been what she had hoped they were. They had never loved her. They had only used her. And in that moment, a sense of freedom washed over her, a strange, almost disorienting feeling. For the first time in years, Daisy felt a flicker of relief. She wasn't a participant in their lives anymore. She wasn't part of their game. She was free, but it wasn't a victory. It wasn't a triumph. It was a hollow, aching freedom, one that came with the painful knowledge that the people who were supposed to be her family had never really cared about her. She had been chasing a ghost for years, hoping for love and acceptance, but all she had found was emptiness. She got into her car and started the engine, the hum of the engine filling the silence. As she drove away, she didn't look back. There was nothing left for her there, no matter how much she had tried to change things. No matter how much she had hoped they would finally see her for who she was. Daisy had come to understand that some things couldn't be fixed. Some wounds were too deep to heal. Her family had chosen their path, and now It was time for Daisy to choose hers. She wasn't going to waste another second waiting for their approval. She wasn't going to spend any more years of her life hoping for something that would never come. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, Daisy felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't going to let them define her anymore. She wasn't going to be their participant. She was going to live her life on her own terms, free from their cruelty, free from their expectations. And as the lights of the city flickered in the distance, Daisy knew, deep down, that this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't just the end of a family gathering. It was the end of a lifetime of waiting for something that would never come, and the beginning of reclaiming her own life, her own worth, her own future. As Daisy drove through the night, the weight of the evening pressed down on her like a crushing burden. She could still hear the echo of John's laughter, feel the sting of the words they had thrown at her, but amidst the pain, something else was stirring inside her, a slow, deliberate rise of something stronger than anger. It was a feeling she hadn't recognized in years. It was control. It was power. For so long, she had been the one who was small, the one who had quietly borne the brunt of their cruelty. She'd let them push her down, let them define her as the failure, the one who could never quite measure up. But that night, as she drove away from their house, something clicked. She wasn't their failure. She wasn't their punchline. She was someone who had been holding the reins all along, only she had never realized it. All the years of her quiet work, of sacrificing her own needs to prop up her family, had left her with something they hadn't counted on leverage. Daisy had never been the loud one, the one who demanded attention, but now, for the first time in her life, she could feel the strength within her, and she was ready to use it. It wasn't just the emotional devastation she had suffered that night. It was the realization that her family had underestimated her, used her, and taken her for granted for years. And now, Daisy was going to take back what was rightfully hers. The house, the family home. Her father had passed away 10 years ago, but she had never truly understood just how much he had left for her until that moment. She remembered the conversations they had had, the quiet moments when he would pull her aside and speak to her seriously, as if he knew something she didn't. She had always thought those talks were about managing the family finances or the trust, about the small details that he had passed on to her as a dutiful daughter. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, Daisy realized just how significant those talks had been. Her father had been a smart man, a man who had seen through John's impulsive nature and her mother's financial ignorance. He had known exactly how to protect the family home, and more importantly, how to protect Daisy. He had put the house in a trust, a revocable trust, with Daisy as a trustee. Imajigan, her mother, had lifetime tenancy. She could live there for as long as she wanted, but that didn't mean she owned it. The house, the family's greatest asset, was not hers to sell, to borrow against, or to control. The deed, the ownership, was in Daisy's name. It was hers. She had known this in theory, of course. She had always known she was the trustee, but in the haze of years spent trying to get her family's approval, she had never truly understood the power that came with that position. As the realization settled in, Daisy felt a strange sense of calm. She'd been sitting on a bombshell for years, unaware of the power she had inherited from her father. And now, she was finally ready to detonate it. She wasn't going to be the one who was powerless anymore. She wasn't going to let John or Magagan or anyone else control her life any longer. She had the legal authority to step in. She had the right to protect the asset that her family had so carelessly taken for granted. She had the right to take control of her own future. But she knew that taking control wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be as simple as sending a text message or making a phone call. It was time for Daisy to show her family exactly what she was capable of. She would use her legal knowledge, her understanding of the trust, and the financial leverage she had built over the years to put them in their place. By the time she reached her condo, the plan had already started forming in her mind. It was clear now. She wasn't going to beg for their approval anymore. She wasn't going to sit around hoping they would suddenly start treating her with respect. No, she would take action. She would start by reminding them who held the real power, the power over the house, the power over the money, the power over their future. Daisy sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled up the documents her father had left behind. The trust agreement, the will, the notes he had made about his wishes for the family home. She read through them carefully, her mind absorbing every detail. Her father had been meticulous. As always, there was a clause in the trust that stated if the property was not maintained in good condition, the lifetime tenancy could be revoked, and with her as the trustee, Daisy had the legal right to conduct inspections and make decisions about the property's future. Her mother and John had assumed they could live there forever, free from any responsibility, taking advantage of Daisy's quiet generosity. But they had overlooked one crucial detail. Daisy could step in and demand that the house be maintained, or else she could decide its fate. And that's exactly what she was going to do. She wasn't going to let them use her any longer. She wasn't going to be the one to pay for repairs, to make sure the house was taken care of while they took it all for granted. She wasn't going to be the one who quietly picked up the slack anymore. Daisy took a deep breath and reached for her phone. She started typing a message to the family group chat, the one that had been so casually created to exclude her earlier. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, but she knew this was the right thing to do. She wasn't going to play their game anymore. She wasn't going to beg them for a place in their lives. Instead, she was going to make it clear that she held the key. The message she typed was short, to the point, and devastating. Good. Check whose name owns the house you live in. She hit send and immediately felt a rush of satisfaction. It was simple, it was direct, and it was the truth. She didn't need to explain herself any further. She didn't need to argue or plead. This was her moment of power, and she was going to let them sit with it, let them panic, let them figure out what came next. As she set her phone down on the counter, Daisy felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. For so long, she'd been the one to play by their rules, to fit into their expectations. But now, for the first time, she was playing by her own rules. She was no longer a pawn in their game. She was the one holding the pieces. Now, it was time to take it further. She had the legal authority to act, and Daisy wasn't going to stop until her family understood exactly what that meant. Daisy sat quietly in her apartment, the silence around her almost deafening. As her phone buzzed incessantly, the message she had sent to her family was simple, but its impact was immediate and undeniable. She knew they would panic. How could they not for years? They had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be the one to clean up their mess, to hold everything together while they lived their lives without consequence. But now, they had been confronted with the stark reality of her position, the one she had quietly held all along. The house wasn't theirs to do with as they pleased. It was hers, and with it, Daisy had power. The first wave of messages came through within minutes. John's was the most direct, dripping with his usual arrogance, but now laced with thinly veiled panic. "What is this nonsense about the house? Dad left it to Mom, not you. Stop trying to play games." The message was aggressive, dismissive, as if Daisy hadn't just exposed the truth to him. But she knew better now. John had always played the role of the confident, untouchable golden child. But in that moment, he had nothing to stand on. Daisy's finger hovered over the message for a moment, the temptation to respond rising in her chest. But she resisted. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The truth was enough. Her mother's message came next. It was long and tearful, painted with her usual manipulation. "Daisy, how could you do this to me? Your father would never want you to be so cruel. Please, don't make me lose my home. This is all I have left." The message was written in a way that tried to make Daisy feel guilty. To sway her emotions back into line, Imagigan had always known how to tug at Daisy's heartstrings. But this time, it didn't work. Daisy read the message with a cold detachment, the same coldness that had begun to spread within her the moment she realized the depth of her family's betrayal. It wasn't about her mother anymore. It was about the truth. Imagigan had been living in the house for free for years, expecting Daisy to quietly carry the weight. But Daisy had no obligation to bear that burden any longer. Megan's message was less direct, but equally manipulative. She started with a fake, sugary sweetness. "I know you're upset, Daisy, but this isn't how families work. You can't just take everything from Mom and John like this. Think about what you're doing." She ended with an emoji, something meant to soften the blow. Make it seem like they were all still on the same team, despite the fact that Megan's words were anything but supportive. Daisy could almost see her, posing for yet another social media update, framing herself as the understanding, compassionate one in the middle of the drama. But Daisy wasn't buying it anymore, for hours. Her phone didn't stop buzzing. The messages flooded in, each one a desperate attempt to regain control, to manipulate Daisy back into their narrative. But no matter how many times they tried to appeal to her emotions or guilt her into backing down, Daisy remained resolute. She had made her decision. There was nothing left for her in this game. They had burned their bridges long ago. By the next morning, Daisy's resolve was even stronger. She had taken legal action, consulting with her lawyer, Sarah, who had been preparing for this moment. The lawyer had already drafted a formal letter to her family, outlining the legal realities of the situation. The property, despite Imagigan's claims of ownership, was in a trust, with Daisy as the sole trustee. It was clear now that her mother could not live there forever without meeting the obligations of maintaining the house in good condition. The years of neglect, The repairs Daisy had quietly paid for had all been noted. Now, the legal clock was ticking. The family's manipulation had failed to sway Daisy. She had seen through the veil of their pretenses. The truth was too powerful to be ignored. As the days passed, Daisy prepared for the inevitable showdown. The inspection of the property was scheduled, and with it, the legal consequences that would follow if the house was not brought up to standard. Sarah had made it clear they had no leg to stand on. John owed Daisy money, and if he refused to pay, legal action would follow. The debts were clear, the evidence irrefutable. Megan, for all her fake concern, had no claim. And Imagigan, her mother, could no longer use her tears to manipulate Daisy into silence. The pressure mounted, but Daisy felt a strange peace settle over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for their approval. She wasn't scrambling to be seen. She had taken control. The legal documents were in her hands. The facts were on her side, and the power had shifted. Her family could no longer hold her back. In the weeks that followed, Daisy's position grew stronger. She had become a force they could not ignore. When the inspection was completed, it confirmed what Daisy had known all along: the house was in disrepair. The damage was extensive, and the neglect was undeniable. Her family had failed to meet the terms of the trust, and now they would face the consequences. Daisy was no longer a participant in their lives. She was the one calling the shots, and she wasn't about to back down. The moment her family realized they had no way out, when they saw the legal documents in front of them and understood that Daisy had the power to enforce the terms of the trust, everything changed. John's arrogance crumbled. Megan's attempts to manipulate fell flat. Madigan, once so certain that she could play the victim, was forced to face the reality of her situation. Daisy had won. She had taken control of her life, and now she was in control of the family home. The house, the symbol of all their years of neglect and cruelty, would be sold. The proceeds, as her father had intended, would be hers. It was more than just the house. It was her victory, her reclaiming of everything they had tried to take from her. Daisy was no longer the failure in their eyes. She was the one who had walked away with everything. As Daisy stood in the empty living room of the family home, a strange sense of peace washed over her. The walls, once filled with memories of a life she had tried so hard to hold together, now felt cold and bare. The house, once a symbol of her family's expectations and cruelty, was just a house now. A structure of wood and nails. It was no longer a home to her. It was just an asset, a piece of property she had taken control of. And in that moment, Daisy realized how far she had come. The fire that had consumed her locket, the cruelty, the years of neglect and mockery, it was all in the past now. The bitterness, the anger, the ache of being unseen, those things had burned away along with her gift. What remained was something she had never expected to find: freedom. Freedom from the expectations of her family. Freedom from the roles they had forced her into. For the first time in her life, Daisy was living on her own terms, and it felt more liberating than anything she could have imagined. She had made the choice to walk away, to no longer let her family define her. She had reclaimed her life, her worth, and her future. The journey ahead was hers to shape, and she was determined to make it a life filled with purpose, adventure, and self-discovery. The lessons she had learned about strength, Resilience and the power of taking control would stay with her forever. Daisy wasn't the failure they had always tried to make her feel like. She wasn't just a participant in their lives. She was the author of her own story, and she was finally writing a chapter where she could be proud of who she was. As she looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Daisy knew that the best was yet to come. She had taken back the power that had always been hers, and now she was ready to embrace the life she had dreamed of. And with that, Daisy took her first step into the future, a future where she was no longer bound by the chains of her family's expectations, a future where she could truly be herself, free from the weight of their judgment. If you found inspiration in Daisy's story, be sure to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences, so feel free to share in the comments below. Stay connected for more content that encourages us all to take control of our lives and rewrite our own narrative.